Hello, this is part two of a note on decolonization. So, as I was saying at the end of part one, there's a lot to be said about the fact that traditional African leaders were sidelined in the decolonization and in the anti-apartheid process. So I'm just going to focus on the anti-apartheid process because that's the one I'm like very much more familiar with. Excuse me, but I do know that across Africa, traditional leaders were not given the preeminence in generally to be the ones who guide the decolonization anti-apartheid process. Now, if you go on the United Nations website and you type apartheid in the search engine there, it will bring up a document written by a former Secretary General who was the Secretary General at the United Nations, I think during the last part of the anti-apartheid movement. So if you look at the United Nations role in the anti-apartheid movement, it was unprecedented. I don't think a lot of people know this, but they played a very unprecedented role in the anti-apartheid movement. And I'm going to talk more about how they sidelined Amakhosi, the traditional leaders of South Africa. But what was also very interesting is that the United Nations effectively created a diplomatic coup d'etat against the National Party government of South Africa. In the 60s, they removed the South African government effectively from the United Nations. And when South Africa was being represented at the United Nations, it was not being represented by the actual government, the National Party government. It was being represented by the ANC and the PAC. Okay. And so it was a coup d'etat, you know what I'm saying? And the United Nations declared the ANC and the PAC the sole legitimate representatives of the will or of the aspirations of the South African people, And yet, this is a situation where the vast majority, probably like over 80% of Black South Africans are living under the rulership of Amakhosi, the traditional leaders of South Africa. So they delegitimized the traditional leaders of South Africa wholesale with that statement. And what happened is that as the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum and became entrenched in the global diplomatic spaces, Amakhosi became vilified as agents of the colonial state, and in South Africa became vilified as custodians of the apartheid system of separate development of the homelands, the Bantustans, right? They were not given any sort of benefits of the doubt that, we cooperated because we don't want our people to be killed wholesale. We cooperated because the National Party government actually gave us plans of how they plan to incorporate Black people into the system, the economic system of the country. Okay. Obviously, this is an economic system which is exploitative. It's based on usury. So I'm not talking about the merits of the economic system. But what I'm saying is that Amakhosi understood that they were playing a role that in the future would secure the well-being of their people. That's how they understood it. Okay. They were not participating in apartheid in the way that they were presented to be participating in apartheid. And I believe that, the ANC and the PAC, by presenting the anti-apartheid movement to the world like they did at the United Nations, because remember, they were the only people who were actually seen as a legitimate voice. So whatever they said was taken as gospel about what was going on in South Africa. No one was asking King Goodwill Zwelithini what he thought of how he thinks the transition away from white minority rule should go. It was all the ANC and the PAC deciding how the transition should go, And so what you had was now a situation where when power is being shifted from the National Party to the ANC, because the PAC at some point, it was just shown that they aren't popular amongst the people as much as the ANC was by any chance, So they kind of faded into obscurity, even though they're still there. But the ANC was essentially given power over South Africa to govern in place of the National Party. So, but with with an undermining of the power of the traditional leaders, even more than what their power was undermined by first the colonial and then the apartheid governments. Because if you look at South Africa today, traditional leaders have no administrative role in this country whatsoever, whereas during apartheid they did, and a very powerful one at that. You know what I'm saying? So I think that, instead of the ANC and the PAC allowing the United Nations to do this diplomatic coup d'etat, they were supposed to have made the United Nations an arena where they brought the National Party and they brought the Amakhosi together to say, how are we going to build a new South Africa that is inclusive, that upholds the human rights of people, that acknowledges the changes that have happened in our political worldview, where most people are more gravitating towards democracy. So this idea of hereditary rulership maybe needs to be translated into constitutional monarchies, as opposed to just direct monarchies and the autonomous rule that kings and queens had in the past. You know what I'm saying? They didn't do any of that. Instead, they just took power and to hell with the traditional leaders, to the point that King Goodwill Zwelithini was prepared to cede KwaZulu from the rest of South Africa and declare an independent nation. Because he was like, there is no way I'm going to be told what to do by this political party that has no respect for my kingship and the kingship of my fellow monarchs in South Africa. And that's legitimate. And it's legitimate not just from a power perspective, but from a social perspective. The vast majority of South African people saw the king as their sole legitimate representative of their aspirations, as their legitimate ruler. You know what I'm saying? Who had navigated, whose family, since his great-grandfather, King Solomon, who was the father of his father, King Dinuzulu, who was the son of King Cetshwayo, who was the son of Mpande. King Solomon was the son of King Dinuzulu, who was then the father of King Cyprian, who was the father of King Goodwill Zwelithini, who is the father of the current king, King Misuzulu today. They saw how from Solomon to Cyprian to Goodwill, they had navigated the Zulu nation through this tumultuous period of colonization and apartheid. So you can't just discount that type of leadership, which has held this nation together, and declare them to be nothing but the lackey of colonial and apartheid powers, right? So for me, if we're going to talk about decolonization, besides all the other stuff I've said, we really do need to talk about the need to rehabilitate the institution of Ubukhosi, traditional leaders in South Africa, because these people play a fundamental role in the spiritual and cultural development of the people of this country. And if they are not included in the process of reforming the economic system, of creating a more equitable political system, of social development, so that people actually have a sense of ownership of this so-called rainbow nation of ours, you're never going to actually address the damage that was done by colonization in South Africa and in the world. Okay, so I think indigenous people across the world, and their leadership need to be given much more space to heal from colonization and to play the vital social role that they play. For me personally, I'm Zulu. I don't speak very good Zulu, and there's a whole story behind why that is. But I'm very much invested in Ubuntu becoming a worldview that plays a vital role in the political, economic, and social development of our country, because I think it is a humane perspective on life that will enable us to create economic and political institutions that affirm the lives of our people, that are being undermined right now by, for example, the poverty and corruption that we see, and which is because of the elitist mind frame that we hold, is somehow justified, is somehow seen as, oh, well, that's just how the cookie crumbles. No, it doesn't have to crumble like that. We could change things, but it starts with us changing our social institutions, which creates our culture, which is the worldview that we hold. Okay, thanks. Bye.